Welcome to the meeting, everyone. I think we're all here remotely today. So apologies. We have one apology this morning from Pádraig De Largy, and Alex Easton will be leaving the meeting at 12 noon in order to attend the funeral. Thank you. Good morning, Fiona, and we have one oral briefing this morning, and it is from the COSACA for the Historical Institute of Beauce, and it's an oral briefing. Can I refer members to pages 7 to 40 of the meeting pack of the relevant papers? And I want to welcome to the meeting this morning Fiona Ryan, Commissioner for Survivors of Institutional Abuse. Can I advise you that this session is being recorded by Hansard and that the transcript will be published on the committee website. Before I invite you to brief the meeting this morning, Fiona, I want to say a few words about Wednesday's meeting. I've already apologised on behalf of the committee, both directly to you, Fiona, and even more importantly, if you will allow me to say this, to the victims and survivors of institutional child abuse. I felt mortified that the meeting lost its quorum during the meeting. One of our members was ill, and 3 of our members gave apologies for either or all or part of the meeting. But the result, which no one intended, was to make even worse the impact on survivors of abuse that they suffered as children and the continued neglect of their welfare since then. So while I have been able, again, on behalf of the committee, to apologise directly to some of the survivors and victims and their groups, I wish to wholeheartedly do so again now. It was unacceptable. We are sorry for the further hurt that we have caused you. Can I invite Fiona, please, to brief the members? Thank you.
Good morning, Sinead. I'm just double checking the technicalities here. Can you hear and see me?
I can hear and see you, thank you.
Great. Well, good morning. First of all, I want to acknowledge your apology on behalf of the committee. And as I said to you during the week, obviously the apology to myself as well. You know, the apology is really, it is to the survivors, and it is about the survivors. And, you know, we all live in the real world where things happen. But at the same time, I would be neglectful if I didn't convey to this committee the deep hurt and upset of survivors after what happened on Wednesday. And I think it's important for all of us in this space with a real commitment to working in this area to understand that for many survivors, they've had a lifetime of their experiences being denied or minimised, their reality being rejected, and they've spent a lifetime carrying a burden that was never theirs to take on. And so what happened on Wednesday for many of them, as they've communicated to me, brought up those feelings again. But I know that your apology and the apology of the committee will go a long way to at least acknowledging that hurt. I said on Wednesday that I had been saddened and disappointed that I hadn't had the opportunity to speak with the committee, and that I felt there was a missed opportunity. I'm really glad that we have this morning the opportunity to recapture that opportunity. And from my perspective, I'm very happy to brief the committee and go forward. So if it's okay with you, Chairperson, I'm going to basically reiterate and repeat the briefing that I gave on Wednesday. So I just want to thank you again for the invitation to appear before this committee. I'm always grateful for the committee's interest in our work and in the wider issues of historical institutional childhood abuse. As I said, my intention is to provide an overview of the work of my office a year on and some of the general issues relating to historical institutional childhood abuse before proceeding to discuss the public apology to survivors, which this committee asked me in November to provide a briefing on. My first priority is to thank the survivors' representatives for their time and generosity in sharing their experience and knowledge with me since I took up post as Commissioner for Survivors of Institutional Child Abuse a year ago. I suppose I should also thank them for their incredible patience, because they've been asked to have a lot of patience. I'm very mindful that what I've asked the committee and indeed the Executive Office to consider, that on the 20th of January, it'll be the 5th anniversary of the publication of the report of the inquiry into historical institutional childhood abuse. January also marks the 9th anniversary of that inquiry actually starting. And I think we all need to reflect and be cognizant. So I'm very grateful, like I said, for the patience that survivors have had with me as I've worked to develop the capacity of my own office. So thank you. I said at the time of taking up post as Commissioner that it was a privilege to do this work. A year on, I believe this to be even more true, as I've had the opportunity, not as much as I would have liked to under current circumstances, to engage directly with survivors and hear for them. I think for all of us who are working to improve the situation for survivors, it's one thing to read about it in a report. It's another to actually, when you meet survivors face to face and you hear from them, whether it's in Derry or Belfast or other parts of Northern Ireland, or indeed in the Republic of Ireland. I'm conscious I've spoken to survivors over in Britain as well. I would have liked to have gotten over there, but I'm hoping to do that in 2022. To actually hear from them of their experiences and the impact on their lives and how they continue to carry this burden. And for the most part, we're talking about people in their 60s going to their 70s, and I've spoken with people in their early 80s. And you were talking about a lifetime legacy of carrying a burden of abuse. And at the same time, I'm highly conscious that many people have passed, and many people have passed before their time. And I think it's a very somber moment. I'm conscious that we're coming up to Christmas week, but it's a very somber moment to consider that for survivors. We've received over 519 separate queries since we started on the 14th of December last year. In fact, this week is our first anniversary. And approximately half of those queries have related to applying for redress and the general redress process. My office has a responsibility under the legislation to provide general advice and information on applying for redress. And we also separately provide information via our website, which is www.cosacha-ni.org, along with the most frequently asked questions regarding redress, which are set out. As of the end of November, the board has received over 2,199 applications, with 1,663 having been considered by a panel. In relation to finding support and services, while my office does not provide direct services, we do signpost survivors to appropriate services when they contact us in person and through our website, where we list the key services and contact details listed. We primarily refer survivors to the VSS, the Victim Support and Survivors Service. And I suppose it's their first anniversary as well this month, in that they launched its services to victims and survivors of historical institutional childhood abuse 2 weeks before us in December last year. So far, 439 survivors have engaged in access support and services, and it's worth noting that many survivors would access more than one intervention. So they could be they could be availing of counselling, and then they may choose a non-talk therapy, for want of a better term. A year on, our intention in the new year as the Commissioner's Office, as I was saying to you, is to reach out to survivors and services and find out what we can do better. We want to engage further with general services to identify how they're meeting the needs of survivors and identify gaps where we can all potentially work together to improve meeting those needs. One gap survivors have highlighted to us is the communications gap and the need to raise awareness of services, the Redress Board, and indeed my own office. I recognise we need to do more to increase awareness. And I've been raising the issue of the need for an integrated awareness raising campaign to do just that with the Executive Office. And I further advised the office to consider an awareness campaign and to implement the campaign as a priority, which would publicise redress services and indeed the Commissioner's Office. There is a precedence for this type of campaign, and I'm thinking of the Inquiries campaign, which it carried out in 2013, where it used a variety of communication channels to reach out to survivors. I've been told by the Executive Office in response that it has started scoping the publicity campaign and it will be focusing on it in the new year. I look forward to working on this campaign initiative with them. As I said, in the meantime, we're seeking to increase our own communications capacity to build on engagement, including both survivors in Northern Ireland and outside of this jurisdiction. We're in the process of reaching out to the Irish centres in Great Britain, and the inquiry itself would have done that in terms of being able to engage with survivors. We're doing this in recognition of the fact that 1 in 8 applications approximately for redress are from survivors in Britain, and VSS applications are around 1 in 6 as well. So I think there is a significant communications and outreach job to be done with survivors outside of this jurisdiction. We had a very real case in point there at the start of the week where it emerged that redress awards would be disregarded in the context of benefits assessment for survivors in Britain. Under the legislation, they had been disregarded in Northern Ireland, and survivor representatives had raised the issue and communicated their concerns to the committee, the Executive Office, the Secretary of State and the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee that this was not the situation in Britain. I raised this issue with this committee on the 21st of April and followed up by writing to the Secretary of State and others as well. I'd like to congratulate the survivor representative groups who have been campaigning on this issue and who have highlighted the gap in the legislation almost as soon as it was passed, and express thanks to officials who have succeeded in achieving a legislative solution. I'm glad the situation now appears to be resolved and appropriate legislation will be coming into place in January, with interim measures in place up until that point. This is the result of consistent awareness raising of this issue by survivor representatives, but again, it effectively highlights the need to communicate to survivors in Britain. And this in turn raises an issue which I raised previously with the committee regarding the lack of research in relation to survivors of historic and institutional childhood abuse, particularly population research. As I said at the start, it's been 9 years since this inquiry started, the inquiry did start. And it's, decades before that, when survivors themselves had to raise the issue of what had happened to them, had to raise the issue of their abuse. And yet we're still asking very simple questions. Where are the survivors? And a key challenge in engaging with survivors are, relatively low disclosure rates of abuse, even to loved ones. So, it behoves us to take that population approach and try and figure out where survivors are. I think it's going to be very important, and I know you have a business background yourself, Chair, it'll be very important to have that knowledge if we're going to go and communicate effectively with survivors. So my intention in 2022 is to scope with other interested stakeholders the capacity for research in this area and assess how we can go forward. The committee asked me before coming here, obviously, to provide my views in relation to public apology as recommended by the inquiry into historic institutional childhood abuse. For context, and I've said this, it's worth remembering that it will be 5 years since that inquiry published its report on the 20th of January 2017. I'd urge all of us to consider and reflect on the significance of this upcoming 5th anniversary of the publication of this report. And as I said again previously, we might also want to consider that January marks the 9th anniversary of the inquiry formally being established. That's 9 years. It's 9 years of survivors campaigning, it's 9 years of survivors waiting, and many of whom are no longer with us. And it's a fact, even in the inquiry's own time span, it's something that Sir Anthony Hart had remarked upon, that there have been those who had passed, sadly, in the context during that time of the inquiry. So I suppose at the end of the 5 years since the inquiry, it's important for us to look and ask what's been done and what's outstanding from the inquiry's recommendations. And I think a brief survey you'd have to look at would be public apology, memorial, and the contributions by the institutions to the cost of redress and specialist services. I think, again, we all have to ask ourselves how we can go forward to undertake the actions needed to make the most difference to survivors. I'm highly conscious that this is the last committee meeting of this year before we go into a new year. And at the same time, I'm equally conscious that the mandate for this assembly is due to run out in the first quarter of next year. And I think, again, that we really need to concentrate our minds on this. As noted in my briefing to you on the 18th of November, the inquiry in 2017 stated that there were mixed reviews regarding the apology. with some survivors firmly demanding an apology and others equally firmly saying they saw no point in one and wouldn't accept it even if it was given. Nonetheless, the inquiry, while acknowledging the spectrum of views, recommended that the Northern Ireland Executive and those who were responsible for each of the institutions investigated where systemic failings were found should make a public apology in a single occasion at a suitable venue. The inquiry saw the value of the apology as a formal recognition by government, a public authority or institution that they or their predecessors had made mistakes in the way they treated children that they were responsible for. I think mistakes, if you don't mind me observing, is a very mild word to describe decades long of systemic abuse of children, where we had the forced breakup of families, where we had denial of basic human rights. It's worth noting again that the inquiry found that it was not only the religious and voluntary bodies that provided and organised the institutions which investigated that were at fault, but it also found systemic failings on the part of public authorities, health and social services boards, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Department of Health and Social Services, the Northern Ireland Office, where it was responsible for criminal justice institutions, and the REC at the time. Coming close to the 5th anniversary, I think it's fair to say that anyone looking at the legacy of this inquiry would have to say there are and have been significant delays in implementing its recommendations. Not only have there been delays, but I would suggest that the relationship between the different recommendations could have been more fully understood and appreciated in terms of prioritisation, sequencing, and how the different constituent elements of the recommendations related to each other in the context of an overall programme for the state relating to historical institutional childhood abuse. The observation around sequencing and prioritisation is important. It may sound like quite a business term to use in this very highly emotive context, but we've seen it impact in the context of apology and its relationship, for example, to the proposed review of the redress process. As I've stated at this committee and to the Executive Office, my view from engaging with survivors has been that the issue is not whether there should be an apology. Even for those survivors for whom the apology personally means very little, there is recognition that apology is a meaningful, symbolic and necessary closure for other survivors. The issue has been for some survivors that the review of the redress process takes place in advance of the apology because they view it as a matter of accountability, which goes to the heart and impacts on the authenticity of the apology. And they've also voiced to me that they resent having to be in the position where it seems like they're being asked to say, choose, is it an apology or is it a review of the redress process? Again, as they've pointed out to me, they've been consistently raising issues around the redress process. I came in front of this committee, I think it was back in April, where I raised issues. This Assembly issued a motion calling for a review of the redress process in July. And I was delighted that this week we did see the announcement of a review of the redress process. But this is the 15th of December. And now we're in a situation whereby we're looking, and it requires urgent attention at those outstanding recommendations. I suppose we also need to recognise, that there are for survivors incredibly strong feelings around the apology, that it is an independent of any other development because it is a recommendation of the inquiry and it is needed for closure, that people are passing before they've received an apology. There are also views, and I would be remiss if I didn't share these with the committee, that some survivors have shared with me to say, certainly we would want an apology, but we don't believe that the executive or the institutions will give an authentic and real apology, and that's based on what has happened for survivors. And I think we need to be cognizant that there are that spectrum of views. And, I've actually said that I recognise the legitimacy of all of those views that have been expressed to me because they're all based on real lived experience from survivors. But nonetheless, but the apology is a recommendation of the inquiry. And so my view is that the review of the redress process should be progressed in parallel with preparations for the public apology, with resources allocated appropriately in recognition of the urgent nature of these matters. But it shouldn't sacrifice the comprehensiveness of this review either. Victims have waited long enough, and it's incumbent upon the executive to deliver on commitments. As I said, I welcomed the announcement on Wednesday that the review of the redress process is due to take place. But again, I would say, we're in December. The motion was passed in July. Survivors have had to wait too long for their voices to be heard and to receive these long-awaited recommendations set out in the inquiry nearly 5 years ago. And I really can't stress this enough. Many survivors are in advancing years. Some are in poor health. And time is of the essence. I think it's important that, again, and I'm conscious that we're talking here about what needs to happen. And I keep speaking about what the inquiry said 5 years ago. But I think for all of us, and particularly for those of us like me who are new, relatively new into this space, to recognise that what I'm saying to you actually isn't new. And that Sir Anthony Hart, 6 months after the inquiry report, told the Assembly at the time, the implementation of our recommendations is urgent because so many of those who waited many years for their voices to be heard and who anxiously await the implementation of our recommendations are now advancing in years and are in poor health. And for them, the prospect of more delay adds to the burden so many have had to carry for so long. That was in June 2017. Survivors need a date for the apology. And I think it's fair to say that services who are supporting survivors need a date. It would be prudent to consider that services may also need additional resources in response to a potential increase in demand for services and support. Again, Sir Anthony Hart noted that for many potential witnesses to the inquiry, reliving their experiences was painful and traumatic, and that some may not have even told their closest relatives or friends about the abuse they suffered. I think it's not without the realms of possibility that, as welcome as the apology may be for many, that by the very fact, and I'm conscious that I'm speaking about it this morning, the committee is going to be asking questions, that even for those who want the apology, these are deeply, deeply emotional issues with the potential to traumatise. And I think we need to make sure that the supports and services are there for survivors as we go forward on this journey with them. As I've said to you already, I think the apology is important to so many for closure, and we need to remember, again, that it is coming too late for many. And their memory through this process needs to be acknowledged. There is an opportunity for survivors to come forward if they choose to. And I think it's always important that we always say it is always a survivor's choice. It is always their agency. They were denied that choice at the earliest age. So it is their choice what they choose to do. We need to make them aware of the information and that there are supports there and that they do have the right to apply for redress. There are other outstanding recommendations from the inquiry, including contributions to the institutions, to the cost of redress and specialist services. I welcome the appointment of independent facilitator Paul Sweeney, and my office has been engaging with Paul in order to facilitate his meeting with survivor representatives in order that survivor views on this very important issue can be incorporated into his overall report to the executive. Another outstanding issue is that of the memorial, which I referenced. Again, the inquiry noted that there was a spectrum of views, with some people wanting a memorial and others not wanting a memorial. And again, both for very, very good reasons. It is a complex issue, but on balance, the inquiry recommended that a memorial be undertaken. In the context of historical institutional childhood abuse, memorial forms part of that symbolic reparation on the part of the state. It should be therefore viewed as part of the expression of recognition, justice, and accountability. Again, however, I would observe that time has been lost in implementing this recommendation and that initial discussions on memorial were commenced in 2017. That process stopped. I recently met with the Arts Council of Northern Ireland in terms of understanding how this recommendation can be taken forward. And I look forward to coming back and providing some insight on this. So again, I want to thank the committee for its time and to say that I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for that briefing. And it is extremely moving to hear you talk about the urgency and the time that has passed since the inquiry. We're talking 9 years and 5 years. separately and waiting on the apology that length of time. But I would say that they're waiting a lifetime on an apology, and whatever that lifetime is for the individual survivors. And it's been too long. And the one thing that is really upsetting about it all, it's about, they seem to be caught in a process, and it's a process that's not effective, and it isn't, putting the victim in the center of it. And there's a sequencing, it seems to be out of sequence, as you said. So there's much you said, but I'm going to leave my remarks and questions for a few minutes, because one of our members has a funeral to attend to, and I want him to have an opportunity to ask a question first, and then I'll come in and ask a few questions afterwards. Commissioner, if you don't mind, can I bring Alex Easton into the spotlight, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. Commissioner, thank you for your presentation. It's just my own quick personal view that I do believe the executive should apologise. They should apologise very quickly. And the longer that there's a failure by institutions and the executive to apologise makes it feel very insincere if and when they do. So I certainly would be wanting to see an apology as quick as possible. That's just my own personal opinion. My question to you, I didn't quite pick up this figure, but you'd mentioned about 2,000 plus coming to you to talk about the redress and taking that forward. I was wondering, can you give me that number again? But also, it strikes me, and you've maybe alluded to it, that it's on the low side. And you mentioned you're doing an awareness campaign. Do you have any thoughts as to why it's quite low? Because I imagine when you listen to things in the media and what you hear, it's considerably higher. And I certainly would be keen for those people who should be part of this, should be part of the redress, that we can reach as many people as we possibly can. So that would be my question, and thank you very much.
Chair, may I go ahead and respond? Thank you very much. I suppose just to, and forgive me, I'm actually getting over a sickness myself. I probably could have said this clearer. In actual fact, the figure that I spoke of related to the redress board, and that it had received over 2,199 applications up until the end of the 30th of November, with 1,663 having gone to be considered by a panel. I think you raised some very, very interesting points. And it kind of goes back to the point that I've been raising around research. The reality is that there was an estimated number of survivors that were expected to go before the redress board and apply for redress. But it is a guesstimate because we really, really have very little information on numbers. And I think that's indicative of the lack of research that has been actually undertaken in relation to survivors of historic institutional childhood abuse. And I think you've provided very eloquently a reason why we need to carry out that kind of public health research. I'm hoping to engage with the Public Health Agency in the new year to have that conversation, to at least scope out, to find out what's possible. So I guess in terms of the number then of over 2,000 applications for redress, we simply don't know whether that's a low figure or a high figure. We do know that thousands of individuals went through the institutions. I guess in terms of then what do you do, because I've been wrestling with this. My own background is I would have been the chief executive of the largest frontline services organisation to victims of domestic abuse, women and children in the Republic, and at least 1 in 5 of those women would have experienced sexual violence as well. And I can tell you from my own experience of working in that area that there are generally low disclosure rates of abuse. And that's in common when you talk to anyone in Northern Ireland. I've reached out to a number of services since I've taken up post and spoke to them about disclosure rates. And the inquiry itself knew or was aware of the fact that by the very nature of child abuse or any form of abuse, people may be reluctant to come forward. Now, it is always a survivor's choice whether they want to come forward or not. But we need to create, it would be my view, that we need to create a supportive situation for them to come forward. So, for example, the redress board was up and running because it was deemed priority 9 months in advance of services being established for survivors. And I've argued since I've come into post with civil servants that in actual fact we need to understand, regardless of the redress process, that the very fact that you're being asked to provide and recount probably the worst time in your life. In fact, you're being asked to re-engage with your trauma means that you should have the supportive services from the time you contemplate this, potentially, all the way through actually applying, and then afterwards, that we build wraparound services around survivors to give them a choice in recognition of the fact that, you know, if any of us on this call or any of us in this meeting were asked to consider the worst period of their lives and then to put it on paper and then to submit it to a solicitor and then through a process, you know, that in itself is a very difficult experience. I'm delighted to see that services are up and running, you know, and that they are available to survivors to support them through the redress process. And I think that goes to the heart then of that awareness campaign that we've been talking about, rather than sort of, you know, creating awareness just of redress or just of services or just even of my own office, that we understand that we need to put forward, again, to use a business term, and I don't mean to be to minimize this in any way by using this term, but what an integrated, you know, marketing awareness campaign. And I would suggest that this would need to happen partially in advance of the apology, in recognition that even if the apology is welcome, it can be traumatizing for people to have these issues brought up in the public sphere. You know, I've had survivors ring my office to say, look, great that you're talking about this, but will you please remember this is really triggering for us as well. And is there any way, you know, you can do something, you know, even with media to make, you know, to create awareness around this. So again, we've spoken about the need for research, the need for an awareness campaign. I'd also say to you, and this is, I've done on a scientific basis, this is based on my engagement with survivors. A lot of survivors are very humble and they start any question or query to you about redress with, look, this is not about the money, or look, I don't want to go for this because people will think I want to just say this. I don't want to go for it because, you know, people are thinking I'm just after the money, you know, and they feel almost like that they don't have the right to apply for redress. And I think we need to get that across, that they are entitled to apply for redress. I don't know if that goes to answering your question.
No, that was sorry. I don't know what's going on there. There seems, is that okay at the moment? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No. That was very helpful, and I do think we need to find some way of being able to find more of the victims to see if they would want to come forward for redress and help them. So if there's anything we can do as a committee to help with that, I'd love to hear what the ideas are, and maybe as a committee we can help push that forward as well for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for that. Can I ask just Fiona a question? Obviously, we had a statement issued earlier this week by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. What's your response to that statement in relation to the review?
I think my response has been that I welcome the review, and I think survivors welcome the review. Many survivors would welcome the review. I know there are different opinions. I think when I came in front of this assembly earlier in the year, I did share with this committee that there had been concerns around communications and the survivor experience of engaging with the redress process. So I think any opportunity that survivors have to engage and to actually share their experiences with a view to providing better outcomes of the redress process is to be welcomed. I think there is concern that the survivors who want the review of the redress process want it to be as comprehensive as possible. And at the same time, and this is not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, but rather that this review was called for earlier in the year. And so while it is welcome, it's coming almost 5 months after the Assembly passed a motion calling for the review. And I think that is challenging because, again, as it has been said to me by more than one survivor group representative, Fiona, our people are getting older. They are passing. They don't have time to wait. So I think ethically, it's beholden on all of us to see how we can ensure, that we can have a better redress process there. Like, I'm very conscious that my own office has a responsibility to provide general information and advice under the legislation on how to apply for redress. And, like as I said, we've managed over 519 queries since we opened up, half of which relate to redress. But I think what we need to do as ourselves, services and the board is to actually look at how we can improve what we're doing for survivors together and just try and put the humanity into it and make sure that survivors, as we spoke about earlier, feel valued and understand that it is important that, that they are seen and they are heard.
Commissioner, when we raised the issue of a review, it was to be short and sharp and delivered very quickly. So whenever this went through the Assembly in July, it was going to be over in 3 months and move on. So obviously that delay has cost a significant amount of time because the review is just starting now. Realistically, do you believe that review can be done within 3 months? And you talked earlier in your briefing as well about the time is running out. Time's running out, obviously, for the victims. They are getting older and there is a sense of urgency and all of that. But you did mention about the mandate is also running out. Realistically, there's 3 months left of this mandate once the return after recess. Can this review be done and be done well and thoroughly and exhaustively in terms of the remit and in terms of reference that it's covering within that 3 month area?
I think it's a good question, Chair. The reality is that we're being given the 3 months. We're being told the 3 months by the Executive Office. Now, we know that they've appointed, I think, Supporting Justice to carry out the review, who have a very good reputation in this area. I mean, very simply, I can't preempt what a review will find, and I can't preempt how Supporting Justice will go forward. I do know the Executive Office has engaged with survivor representatives around the terms of reference for this review. I think it's fair to say, and I mean, I've gone on the record about this previously, that, time is of the essence, and that, if we can implement in a managed way those actions that need to be undertaken in a timely way, so that we're not sacrificing any potential quality issues or comprehensive issues, then that needs to be done. My hope would be that we can achieve this review, because for those survivors who are concerned and who have expressed their concern on the record to this committee, to other Assembly members, to the Executive Office themselves, to ministers, where they have put their concerns on the record about review, that they can find satisfaction from this process. I also think that, we've been talking about encouraging survivors to come forward that it is a sign of the commitment and robustness of the system, that it can review itself and actually say, look, we've looked at ourselves. Here's how we think we can do this better. Here's how we're going to go forward, and to signal that clearly to survivors.
And can I ask you, can you see any reason why the process for an official apology, a fulsome official apology that brings in state and agencies, etc., together, should be affected by the review of the redress process? Is there any reason why they can't work in parallel, but they can't be, the one can't be delivered without the other?
I think I've gone on the record of saying to you that among survivor representative groups whom I've engaged with, there is no issue around having an apology, okay? Even where survivors will say to you, look, Fiona, honestly, too little, too late, but I understand how important this is for other survivors, and that's why this an apology, a public apology, needs to happen. At the same time, when you have survivors saying to you, and survivor representatives saying to you, look, there are real issues with the redress process. This is part of the reparations framework, right, to us as survivors, and yet at the same time, we're meant to accept that an apology is wholesome, fulsome, authentic, while we're having issues with a whole other part of that reparations process or, framework. My own view, and, I said this in my briefing to you back in November, was that I would have rather the review had been undertaken earlier and that it had been progressed in parallel with preparations for the apology. In recognition of the legitimacy of the different survivor representative perspectives and positions on this issue. So, do I think that the preparations for the apology need to go ahead? Yes, I do. Do I think that the review of the redress process needs to go ahead? They do. They need to be in parallel. But what I've also encouraged the Executive Office to do is to say that, or rather to do, that they will put the resources in place to get this review across the line in a timely manner without sacrificing any comprehensiveness. I've mentioned it a few times in front of this committee. We're coming up to the 5th anniversary on the 20th of January of the publication of the inquiry's report into historic institutional childhood abuse. That is a milestone date. And as you rightly pointed out, we are coming up to the end of this mandate for this assembly. I think many survivors, want and need to see an apology for closure.
And they deserve it. And I don't see any reason why something of significance could not be delivered to mark that significant milestone in the 20th of January. I'm going to ask probably a loaded question now before I hand it over to the rest of the things. And that is in relation to how the department is managing these processes. Obviously, as a committee, our role is the scrutiny of the Executive Office. How would you have done things differently? How could it have been achieved better outcomes in relation to the processing, the sequencing, and all of that? Because, it's as if every so often the ball is dropped, it's lifted up again, there's a reaction, it's lifted up again, and there doesn't seem to be a strategic, a strategic thread that is moving along succinctly, that people are getting the results as they need them. And I'm really concerned about that. And I'm concerned about that because We are dealing now with the Historical Institute of Abuse, the survivors, but also we're engaged in another process in relation to the Mothers and Babies institutions. We've got to learn where we did it wrong and how we can do it better. So sorry, Commissioner, for putting you on the spot, but how could we have done this differently?
I suppose I'm acknowledging it's a good question to ask. It's a tough question to answer, but it's a good question to ask. And I want to preface any comments that I make now to say, and I'm sure there will be many, particularly departmental officials listening, going, it's easy for you. I've been here a year. And so that is the perspective that I offer. I would offer the view then that I think it would have been helpful and constructive to have adopted a programme of work in relation to historic institutional childhood abuse, and to have understood that the varying constituent elements contained within do have a dependency and do influence each other, and that we do need to set out prioritisation and sequencing. And to a certain extent, it feels like we're living with the legacy of what could have been done around sequencing and prioritisation, which is why we're in a situation now where, when we come back, we have, I think, is it 2.5 months to the end of this Assembly's mandate?
Yeah.
And we're now in a situation whereby, I've gone on the record, I've said to you, I believe the apology process needs to be progressed. And at the same time, I'm conscious that there is a serious review needs to be undertaken of the redress process. And that survivors are in the middle of this, yet again, waiting. So if you look at this, and I think a clear example is that I gave earlier, where you had development of services for victims and survivors of historic institutional childhood abuse starting 9 months after a redress process has been initiated, when even in the context of the inquiry, Sir Anthony Hart would have recognised, I think anyone would recognise, the traumatising potential of even doing something positive in the context of this form of inquiry, whereby, you're being asked to give a testimony. And to a certain extent, when you go forward for redress, that's what you're being asked to do. You're asked to recount your experiences in writing, of your time in an institution. So, yes, I think that there could have been a programme of work taken on at departmental level and understood as a programme. This is not to say that work wasn't carried out, but rather, and again, this is an opinion and observation a year in, that it could have been understood in the context of interrelated projects that need to be prioritised and sequenced, and their interdependencies understood. You spoke about mothers and babies. I think, again, survivors have said to me, because they have heard of the developments going on in mothers and babies and the whole process of co-design, consultation with survivors very early on, ensuring that services are in place, and while I know that they've shared with me that they are happy that this is happening, because I'm sure you're aware of the fact that there is a certain amount of crossover as well between mothers and babies and historical institutional childhood abuse. And I've met survivors who had been in the institutions and then were in mothers and babies' homes. And I've also met survivors of the institutions who were there having their mums having been in the mother and baby homes. And they say, well, that's great that the state is learning from this, but I think we have more value than just being, a learning example or a guinea pig. It's like it would have been better if this had been understood when all of this was happening for us. And I mean, I think all I can do as a commissioner is acknowledge and reflect that, which is what I've attempted to do here in answering your question. Yes, it would have been better if this had been understood. But I would say to you now, and as I said to the committee at the start, we have an opportunity now to do something different. And I think my experience from engaging with the Executive Office more recently is that understanding of those interdependent pieces of work, those interdependencies, including redress, including services, including ourselves, they are being better understood. And so what I've been looking for, which I think anyone who is involved in any form of project is, can we have dates? Can we have timelines? Can we have action plans? And obviously it's beholden on us to play our part in all of those as well.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And I didn't mean in any way to indicate that we wanted to learn for the next process. I think that it's just that connectedness of learning, and I think, you know, the review, and obviously then the redress itself, as you meet some of the overcome some of the difficulties that we have in it, and the provision of services in and around that. But certainly the apology and the memorial and can happen, and the redress in this mandate, albeit short, but it would be a failure of the executive not to complete this work in the short space of time that they have left, because we've left a lot of things too long. So can I hand over? I may come back and ask another question at the very end if you don't mind, but can I hand over now to John Stewart for the next question? Can we bring John into the spotlight, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. Commissioner, can you hear me okay?
I can. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Good to see you again. Can I start by echoing the apology given, and the sincere apology given by the Chair, just for what happened on Wednesday. I know I spoke to you on Wednesday evening, and I want to echo that apology. I think it was very poor what happened and disappointing. And I also want to commend you for your ongoing work on behalf of victims, for the victims groups. I've spoken to a number of them over the past couple of days, and the individual victims, and I know how they felt, and hopefully on the back of today, a lot of that will go, and we can get back focused on what exactly needs to be done. But I just wanted to get that on the record, and thank you again for coming back today and for giving us more of your time, because we do really appreciate it. Just to get into a couple of the key issues, we continue to hear from the First and Deputy First Minister, from junior ministers, from the Executive Office, that they are fixated and focused on a victim-centred approach. Yet when I speak to victims groups or individual victims, they don't feel that that's been the case and continues to be the case, whether that is because of a lack of communication, missed times and commitments, and just the process in general and the redress scheme. And I think one big issue is that failure of the apology. And I think there's so much to it, but if you can't get an apology right, and you can't even give a timeline for an apology, I think everyone just thinks, well, how else can you get the more complicated aspects right? So you've mentioned, you know, January is a very fitting date, whether that's 9 years since the beginning of the Hart Inquiry or 5 years since the publication. I think that is something we should all be aiming towards. Do you think that is possible? And do you agree that it would be a fitting time to do it and to get that apology right?
Thank you for your question. I think in terms of, and you've pretty much said this very articulately, that there are a number of moving parts here. I think the 20th of January is an important date, symbolically, because it allows us to concentrate our minds. It is, you know, I think when there is, in general, an issue that's discussed and talked about, there is a sense that we almost lose that sense of actually the time that has passed. And I was quite shocked myself when I looked at 9 years, 9 years
Crazy.
Since the inquiry had started. I know this is probably not going to be a popular perspective, but I've always been honest with the committee. I think we are in the situation now whereby, and I had warned at the beginning of the year, I think around April, May, that if we didn't get the issues around redress resolved, that they would come and intersect with the issue around apology. Because I, like you, have been hearing very strongly from survivor representatives. This was not just noise. This was very real for a number of survivor representatives, you know? And yet here we are now in December. And my concern that I'm sharing with you is that that we will potentially seek to do everything at once, and potentially rush in. And at the same time, I'm massively conscious of the urgency that's there. So we have the 20th of January as a date. We do know that, my understanding is, you can correct me here, that the mandate for this assembly is over in mid-March.
That's right.
Would that be correct? So I think definitely the date of the 20th of January is one to concentrate our minds on. But I think, if we're in a situation whereby, and this is a view, I have not had a widespread discussion about this per se, if there is, say, by the end of January or even at the start of February, that we aim for that. But I think the important thing for all of us is we need a date. We need a date that we can actually go forward with,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I suppose the skeptic in me and in victims groups as well is that we keep being told, whether it's by the First or Deputy First Minister. In fact, I think it was the Deputy First Minister nearly a year ago that said an apology would be a top priority. And I've no doubt that it is, but I suppose I just can't get my head around, and victims groups can't get their head around why it's so difficult to get to that stage where what seems like something so simple couldn't be achieved within that time frame. So I suppose to move on to my next question, are you content, or do you think that TO officials have now got enough of the information they require, given that they've been liaising with victims groups for years now? I mean, are all the ducks in line to make it happen? But where is the backlog and the hold up, and why can't it happen? Or am I missing something?
I think, and I'm going to again say to you that I think apology needs to be understood as a process. One of the things that I had advocated for was that, again, and I think this is probably because of my background providing services to victims of abuse, albeit a different forms of abuse, was that we needed to understand that we needed to create awareness within the wider service provision sector, that services need to be made aware. They need to be given a date, and that we needed to understand that if we're going to talk about apology, as we are now, that someone watching this could well want to go and have a conversation with someone about their experiences. And I think it's really important that we understand that, what an apology is, an event is a very important and symbolic, and I'm reflecting the language of the inquiry here, is a very important and symbolic initiative to undertake, that there needs to be understood that there's a period before the apology, during the apology, and after the apology, where survivors will need support and resources to be provided. And I think that needs to be understood. And I've said this again throughout the year, okay? So in terms of my understanding is that the Executive Office has been, and I know that they have been engaging very proactively, particularly in the last couple of months with survivors, survivor representative groups, to move it forward. And I think that's hugely positive, because we have to give credit where some form of improvement or development is happening. But at the same time, we need a date.
Yeah.
Survivors need a date. And that's why I've been talking about the 20th of January, saying the symbolic significance of that date. At the very least, at least let us consider it and reference it, because it does form a milestone.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree, Commissioner, and I think hopefully that's something can come from this committee today, that we can speak with one voice to say that is something that should and now could very much happen. You touched it then, lead me into the next question about resource, and not only supporting victims but also the support and the resources within the Executive Office. And there's obviously the newly formed team under Mr. Gallagher. Are you content that they have the resource within that department, either in terms of people power or finances and support, logistic support, to do the work that's necessary in an appropriate time frame?
I understand the question you're asking. I think it's probably outside my remit, though, however, to comment on it. What I can say to you is that I think recruitment has been an issue for all of us this year. My own office in particular we've been running probably at around 60% of our own staffing capacity. Now, I'm very happy to report that we have been able to get new staff in. My office had been predicated on, say, civil servants and being seconded to the office, but that didn't happen, and it couldn't happen. So consequently, we've been running at about 60% capacity, but we have been relying on agency staff coming in, and, you know, obviously we've prioritised engagement with survivors. So, you know, we're looking forward, obviously, ourselves to getting up to a full complement. I do know that the Executive Office itself has had issues with staffing and capacity, and so I'm not in a position to comment regarding its own current arrangements. Wouldn't be appropriate. But what I can say is that my role is to advocate on behalf of the interests of victims and survivors, and that if I perceive that there is a need for, say, additional resources for services, for example, obviously the service providers are well able to advocate themselves on their own behalf, but if I perceive that there being a gap, then I will bring it to the attention of the Executive Office to say, look, you know, we've noticed this is what's been said to us and also what we've noticed, and, like, you know, what can we do to move forward on this?
Okay. The Net Office, but yours of what you said. I'm not this morning. We're taking the time of these groups and for everything they're doing to advocate. Pardon any way I can. So thank you. Good morning.
You're welcome.
Chair,
Thank
can
you.
I hand it back to you?
Okay, thank you, John, for that. And can I now bring Pat Sheehan into the spotlight, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Fiona, for coming along again this morning, especially in the context of what happened the other day. And I also want to reiterate the apology made by both Sinead and John in regard to what happened the other day. And I fully appreciate and understand that victims and survivors felt insulted and disrespected as a result of what happened. And I mean, I suppose all I can say is that it's something that rarely happens, and just some unforeseen circumstances happened the other day. For example, the committee would have been quorate, only my colleague Padraig Delargy took ill during the committee and has since been diagnosed with COVID. So, and others had given apologies as to why they wouldn't be there at the committee, or in my own case, why I had to leave early. So I just, again, want to give a heartfelt apology to yourself, Fiona, but especially to the victims and survivors of historical institutional abuse. And I hope our coming together again very quickly will allay some of the fears that the committee don't care about them, or don't care about what they have suffered over many years. So just first of all, Fiona, could I ask you to characterise your engagement with the Executive Office, both with ministers and with officials, in regard to the processing of an apology and in terms of the review of the redress process? Thanks.
Thank you. I think my view has been from the start that it is my role to represent the interests of victims and survivors of historical institutional childhood abuse in any process that's going forward. Since taking up post, I've prioritised engaging with victims and survivor representatives, but also individual survivors. And so when I am engaging with the Executive Office, it is very much based on that experience of hearing from survivors and what their concerns are. In terms of, say, the redress process, I mean, I was hearing very strongly, but so was the Executive Office and ministers themselves, that there were concerns from some survivors in relation to aspects of the redress process, different aspects of the redress process. So I think it's always important to recognise, and I think as a commissioner, and any commissioner who is advocating on behalf of a particular group, that while we have an advocacy responsibility and remit, that the survivors themselves, we're not a substitute for the survivors. They themselves are the experts on their lived experience. They are the campaigners. They have spent decades campaigning. So as far as my own attitude to this was that we are adding our voice. We are reflecting what individual survivors say to us, but we're very much campaigning or advocating in the context of the survivors themselves. And the survivors themselves, representatives, had been letting the Executive Office know that there were issues with redress, and that's very early on. In relation to apology, I've set out that there was a spectrum of opinions. I'm reflecting effectively what the inquiry found itself almost 5 years ago. I think from my engagement with the Executive Office in relation to apology, that there were that its own thinking has evolved in that time, and that there is a better understanding now of the need for overall how the different moving parts of historical, institutional, childhood abuse, state response interact with each other. And I suppose that is part of that learning and developing for all of us in that space. And so, and particularly in relation to services, and you can see, and again, I hate using the example of what has happened with historic institutional childhood abuse, but you can see how that learning is filtering into the system and how it is hopefully going to provide a benefit for mothers and babies. So I've basically sent in any briefings or responses that I've been asked to provide, and sometimes volunteering them, Pat, as well, whether I was asked to provide them or not. For example, in relation to apology, we want to look around for good examples of where apology had happened. We'd looked around internationally, and we spoke, for example, to the Danish government, who'd had a very successful apology about what they had undertaken, what they had done, and we had actually given that back into the Executive Office. We also provided a pretty comprehensive briefing in May to the implementation branch from the Executive Office, and then we provided a briefing again, I think, in October, November on apology. So I think we've been consistent all the way through. My view has been that victims and survivors, fundamentally, what is a successful apology? It's an apology that works for victims and survivors. We've put forward, and again, I gave this in the briefing to the committee, the key principles of what makes a good apology. And they're based on Professor Anne-Marie McAlinden's work in Queen's University Belfast, and indeed other academics in University of Ulster as well, whereby we know what constitutes, based on international good practice, a good apology. I don't know if that answers what you're...
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Fiona. And I mean, you've mentioned on a number of occasions now the number of moving parts in all of this. And one other moving part you've mentioned is the communication gap when it comes to raising awareness of services for victims and survivors. And I'm presuming you have also raised this with the Executive Office. And I'm just wondering, how was that received? And do you think there's a plan in place, or have you advised of a particular plan that might be put in place in order to raise greater awareness of services that survivors, as you pointed out, may need before an apology, during an apology, and afterwards? So, thanks.
I have, Pat, actually. I've raised on a number of occasions now with the Executive Office. I included the campaign, I guess, I call it, forgive me, it's from coming from a communications background, but an integrated awareness campaign whereby, we start off with what is it survivors are going to need, and basically we create awareness about those. Like I said, there's a precedent from what the inquiry undertook in 2013. I have separately engaged with the Executive Office again to raise this with them. And I think I said in my briefing that they've actually reverted back to say they are scoping out the potential for a publicity campaign in early January, and that they would be engaging with ourselves and the VSS and others. Hopefully, obviously, we're looking to engage with survivors as well, in relation to taking that campaign forward. I would rather see it happen sooner rather than later, and I have advocated for that.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Fiona, and I wish you well in the work ahead, especially in the next weeks or months, and that we reach a successful conclusion for all victims and survivors of this terrible abuse. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you very much, Pat. Can I bring Trevor Lunn into the spotlight, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just check you can hear me okay, because my signal is dropping in and out here like a yo-yo. Fiona, thanks for your presentation. Can I, first of all, reiterate what everybody else has said about last Wednesday? I had to apologise. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually happen that we run out of quorum, especially for something as important as your presentation, frankly. And in my case, it was compounded by the fact that the last time you appeared before the committee, I was getting my second vaccine jab, and it didn't go very well, so I missed that one as well. We can't defend a 5-year process, which was supposed to be urgent. I mean, this is just terrible, and everybody obviously agrees with that. I just hope we can accelerate the system and the processes now and bring this to more of a conclusion. I don't think the end of this mandate means the end of the process, to be honest. It's not like legislation which will fall. So let's just hope we can start to do our job properly. You mentioned the low disclosure rates and the communications gap about services when you were giving us your presentation. I suppose I should be encouraged by the fact that there's about 2,200 applicants now already, and that figure will rise. But from my recollection, the original estimate might have been several times up, maybe up to about 8,000. What's the manner of the communication where we try to reach out to survivors and victims? I mean, how are we going about that? What's the method of communication that we're using?
Thanks, Trevor, for your comments at the start and for the question. I think, there's a lot to unpack in your question. There's a lot in there. I think, first of all, we need to understand the nature of any form of abuse, okay? The majority of survivors of any form of abuse generally do not disclose, particularly to any form of official authority, but even they may minimize their disclosure to their friends, families, and sometimes they minimize that to themselves. They may acknowledge a certain amount of abuse, but not to the full extent of their abuse. And that is a massive challenge because it's a coping mechanism. So I think if you're looking at how do we engage with survivors, one of the things that my office has done, for example, is trying to figure out how can we reach out to survivors without necessarily knowing where the survivors are, without necessarily knowing who they are, and at the same time get a message that, this is what's available, but it is always your choice. Because I would always say survivors have had agency robbed from them as children. And that if we actually, no matter how good intentions you are, attempt to rob that agency as well, then we would be doing wrong. So in that process, we reached out to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, and I reached out to the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse in London. And I reached out to them from the point of view of not so much the actual work that they're pursuing, but rather their approach to engaging with survivors. And they have a number of different approaches. But I think what we can't get away from is that the majority of people whom we will be engaging with are looking at who are survivors, are in potentially their mid to late 60s, early 70s, early 80s. And if you look at the age profile from survivors who are engaging with the Victims and Survivors Service, that is the age profile. And generally for people of that profile, of that age group, and I'm speaking on gross generalizations here, okay? Mm-hmm. You're talking about relying on traditional media, so television, radio, newspapers, maybe with some Facebook. So I think if you are, probably most important of all will be word of mouth with other survivors, okay? So you're looking at creating publicity or awareness, primarily, I would think, using those channels in order to reach survivors. Now, we do know that, as I said, until the 30th of November, there have been over 2,000 applications to the Redress Board. My understanding had been that when the Redress Board was thinking, obviously developing a business case, that they had to pick a figure. But I think, to be fair to everyone in this process, because there hasn't been research done in a comprehensive manner, numbers are very much in the estimate. So I think the Redress Board had considered that it could be looking at 5,000 applications, but that figure could be bigger. And, I think the TEO itself, we're looking at the numbers that have gone through the institutions, and that figure could be exponential, So yes, I think you're right to say that certainly we would imagine that there would be more than 2,000 survivors there. And that's why I think it's incumbent that we do create the public awareness around historic institutional child abuse. In fact, I've advocated to the Executive Office that there's an opportunity with the apology, to actually, that you will get a certain amount of publicity and interest from the apology itself, that it's happening, and that potentially there's an opportunity there to create an awareness campaign, around apology, and afterwards to build on that awareness that might have been risen to begin with, so we can reach out to more people to make them aware of what's there.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
I hope you can still hear me, because okay. Has there been any cooperation from the institutions involved in all this to identify survivors and victims? They should, I know some of them don't, but they should have records of at least who passed through the institutions. Is there any mileage in that we could perhaps contact people through that medium?
I think, obviously you're aware that the independent facilitator, Paul Sweeney, has been appointed, and he's actually engaging with institutions around the issue of the contributions by the institutions to the cost of redress and specialist services. I think, and this is obviously an opinion, I would imagine many survivors, because of their experiences with the institutions, would not particularly welcome any form of engagement being mediated through the institutions. I'd imagine there could also be potentially GDPR concerns. I do think that perhaps where there is a learning for us is to understand where the main institutions were. For example, we know that there was a concentration in Derry and Belfast in Northern Ireland, and that from that we can extrapolate that many people continue to live in, many survivors continue to live in those key urban areas, and I think that could inform how we go forward with an awareness campaign. At the same time, we recognise that there were institutions across Northern Ireland, and so we need to make sure that it's a very broad-based campaign, but that probably with the recognition that the majority of survivors are probably still based in those two main urban centres.
Okay.
But
just the last one, Chair, if you don't mind, the apology that you'd be looking for, or we're looking for, would obviously be a corporate one from the government. Have the individual institutions along the way made any attempt to apologise, or would they feel constrained from doing that by perhaps liability questions?
I obviously can't comment in relation to the institutions because I don't have engagement with those institutions. My understanding is that the Executive Office is engaging with the institutions around the issue of apology.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, it's nice to meet you face to face at last. I apologise again for what's happened in the past. I'll try and do better in future. But thank you very much for your presentation and your fine words today. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And can I bring Christopher Stolford into the spotlight, please?
Thank you, Chairperson. Can you hear me okay? I can't hear you.
Sorry, because I was on mute, Christopher.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Thank you. We can hear you. Thank you.
So just firstly, Thank you, Fiona, for being with us, and I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation. I'm on the issue of an apology. Where would that sit? And there's a review, obviously, process going on, and I'm just wondering, in the context of that review of the redress board taking place, is that one of the potential reasons why the apology hasn't been forthcoming much more quickly?
I think it's, sorry?
No, go on ahead.
Oh, apologies, there was some feedback on the line. I think I represented here the spectrum of views in relation to the apology and the redress review that have been expressed to me by various survivor representatives. And I've said that I can understand and would respect the legitimacy of the perspectives put forward, but I am mindful of the fact that the reality is we are now nearly 5 years after the inquiry, nearly 9 years since it started. And Sir Anthony Hart himself said 6 months after the end of the inquiry that there was an urgency in implementing those recommendations. And I've outlined for the committee what I believe are the outstanding recommendations, which were apology, memorial, and obviously, I think I referenced as well the contributions by the institutions to the cost of redress and specialist services. I personally have said to the Executive Office and have gone on the record as saying that there have been issues with the redress process. And in fact, I said it in front of this committee earlier in the year. I told the Executive Office that there were issues. And in fact, the Executive Office, did not need to hear from me, but they did. But they heard very significantly from survivor representatives that there were issues with the redress process. So they've been aware of this fact and the fact that a review was called for by the Assembly in July.
Yeah, just on I recall, I think it was a seminal moment in the history of the Irish Republic, the response of Enda Kenny to the publication of the Cloyne report. And I think I think everyone would now see that as a very seminal moment. The wording of that was very clear and direct. And then I recall sometime later, there was criticism in terms of the response and in relation to the response given to those who had worked in Magdalen laundries, because people felt that it wasn't an absolute direct apology to the people who were affected by that slavery, because let's call it what it was slavery. I'm just wondering, could you talk to what the process should be in terms of ensuring that the form of words in an apology is absolutely right, because you can only do it once, and it's absolutely essential that it's got right when it is done.
I think you're absolutely right. What you're talking about, it can only be done once, and I think that's why it puts a really weighted importance on the process needed to achieve the apology. And that's something that I very much underlined, I think, to the Executive Office. First and foremost, what's our definition of success of an apology? And this may sound quite ephemeral, but a successful apology is an apology that is met with the approval of victims and survivors. So we start with that as our working point and come back from that. And I think, we're very lucky to have experts, academic experts, who have worked in this space, who've examined what actually makes a good apology. And I've been advocating very early on that we should very much look at the findings of what makes a good apology. And again, I provided those in the briefing to you, which is, that it needs to be a wholehearted acknowledgement, an undertaking of non-repetition. There can't be, equivocal language. You need to ensure that any apology is offered. It is offered to survivors with no expectation that it will be accepted. And I've put all of those in, say, briefings to the Executive Office, and I also shared those with this committee back in November, in terms of process, I think the Executive Office has taken that on board. I know the implementation branch has reached out to survivors, and they've literally, survivor representative groups, and they have taken those 5 core principles that have been outlined by like Professor Anne-Marie Lecca-Linden and her work around apology. And they've basically sought to, and forgive me if I'm being too technical here now, they've literally, for each point, or each principle, put forward core points according to principle, and then invited survivor representative groups to comment and come back. And I think that's the process they're currently pursuing at the moment.
Just one final question. It had been indicated previously, I think it was the Deputy First Minister, but I can't be absolutely certain on that. It had been indicated previously that progress had been made in terms of, well, I'd said, extracting a contribution from some of the institutions concerned. And throughout this process, this has been a constant theme for me. Of course, the state must make a contribution because we ultimately, the state, handed people over to these institutions. But equally, these institutions, some of them, sit on enormous resources. And I think it's essential that they make their fair contribution. And there's, I'm just wondering, have you any update on that? Is there any progress being made? My chief concern, frankly, because we've seen it happen elsewhere throughout the world, my chief concern, frankly, is that they move their money, dispose of their assets before they can be made to pay. And I'm just wondering if you want just to talk to that.
Well, as I said to you earlier, I have been facilitating the independent facilitator, Paul Sweeney, to engage with survivor representative groups. And to be absolutely fair to Paul, he approached my office and said, look, I've been given this role. I want to ensure that survivors' views are heard in this process, which is why he has been engaging. Survivors themselves have been telling me, and I would say to the committee that this is based on my own conversations. It's anecdotal. It is not scientific, but it is anecdotal, that for a significant number of survivors, they again see the contribution by the institutions as a matter of accountability. Don't tell us you're sorry if you're not willing to be accountable, and to actually demonstrate that accountability. Now, other survivors have said, you know, honestly, whether it's the state or the institutions, that's not our primary concern, okay? You know, we've basically had a lifetime of this. So frankly, you go resolve that with each other. But I think taking a step back, one survivor did share with me their view that I think someone had been messing, you know, and said, oh, you know, about the, say, redress, you know, well, you got sorted now, you know, and it was the sense that they were being paid for. And the survivor said to me, and you know, the funny thing is, Fiona, I've paid taxes all my life. Effectively, I've paid for my own redress. And, you know, and this might seem to the committee in the midst of all these really important big issues that we're engaging with, a smaller issue that this person experienced this in their own daily life. But it was hurtful, you know, it was hurtful because they had felt that, you know, and quite rightly, and any survivors listening to this, you know, I mean, you know, you're talking about, you have the right, you know, you have the right to apply for redress, you know, and the conditions are very much there if you've experienced abuse in an institution from, I think, 1922 to 1995. But the reality is that for some survivors, and I always have to stress this because, you know, survivors are individuals, they're people. They have had very different experiences and they have different opinions. You can't just take everyone as if they're a homogenous group. So what I'm sharing with you here are the experiences of individual survivors. But I think to be cognizant of your point that this is about accountability, you know, and some survivors have said to me that they very much feel it, and not in some kind of remote way, but in a very real way in their lived life.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Christopher. Can I bring Emma Sheeran into the spotlight, please?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Fiona. I'm not sure. Apologies. I had to come in via my browser because for some reason my tablet wouldn't allow me to hear anyone on the meeting. So I've dropped in and out a few times, and I may have missed some of the contributions. But thanks for coming into us again on Friday, and again reiterate the apologies that have been issued by others in terms of what happened on Wednesday afternoon. I had some questions around the apology, and I know you've discussed this at length, and most of what I had wanted to ask has probably been covered at this stage. And I know you've focused on the date of the 20th of January, and one of the things that I had wondered about was whether or not setting a deadline was something that yourselves would consider, and if that would be helpful. And I'm not sure, perhaps that would work in the opposite way, in terms of insinuating then that the apology was only issued because organisations were compelled to issue it, or the executive was compelled to issue it. So I don't know how viable an option that would be. But I suppose what I'm getting very strongly from your presentation and from the conversations that you've had with other members here is that this process has been completely drawn out and has further compounded the hurt of victims and survivors. And obviously everyone has different experiences and different reactions to the trauma that they have went through, and wants different things out of the apology. And I'm wondering then what learning there is from that around the memorial, which you've outlined as another priority coming out of this process. So I suppose, notwithstanding that the apology hasn't been issued yet, have you got thoughts around what could be done better when it comes to the memorial, and what not to do from the process around the apology?
Thanks, Emma. Excuse me, I have to apologise as well. I'm getting over COVID. I had COVID 2 weeks ago, so my voice has probably been fading in and out on this call as well. I think there are key learnings all the way through, and the reality is that I think as a system, all systems, if they're to grow and develop, need to learn. And sometimes it has felt that the learning has been slow to come through the system. Okay. And I'm sure commissioners aren't supposed to say things like this, but what the hell, I'm saying it anyway. The learnings have been slow, and I think there have been frustrations, but that doesn't mean that we don't start now, that we don't start learning now going forward. And primarily, I think it is to understand, to hear the voices of survivor representatives, to hear the voices of survivors in whatever we undertake. You referenced the apology. I think it's important that, and I think anyone who's worked in anything will say to you, you need dates, you need timelines to work towards. To concentrate our minds. And I think not so much a deadline, because that implies some kind of you have to do this by then or else. But I think that we have an ethical and a moral imperative to say, look, we need to find a date here, so to give people something that they can say, right, that's going to happen then. What do we need to do? If we were, if nothing else, this is about ensuring a proportionate and good management of this going forward. In relation to memorial, and I appreciate the chairperson would want to ask a question earlier as well. I mean, that memorial process had started in 2017. The inquiry, again, makes it very clear in its recommendations that there was a spectrum, and there are spectrums of opinions in relation to memorial, but it came down very definitively in calling for a memorial and actually setting out that where it should be, and that its purpose was to remind the Assembly of what had happened to these children and serve as a warning or, for children, that it would ensure that children were treated better to come. And that, like I said, the process had been undertaken. It had been asked of the Arts Council of Northern Ireland that it would recommended that the Arts Council of Northern Ireland would take it forward. And then that process just stopped again in 2017. And I think it's, how do we breathe life into it again? How do we start that conversation about memorial? Now, one of the things that I'm doing is I have reached out to the Arts Council of Northern Ireland to have that conversation, to seek how they will go about starting the process around memorial. And what I would like to do is to actually look in the new year at what is the best practice we have out there. I've gone on the record in previous committee appearances where I've said, the inquiry made a very solid recommendation. I think that is our starting point, but we know that there are other innovative examples of memorial across the world as well. So let's look at what else has been done, because a memorial is important. The memorial that was specified in the recommendation or in the inquiry as a solid recommendation, I believe does need to happen. And that's with respect to the fact that there are a spectrum of opinions. But I think the first thing we need to do is to engage with survivors and find out what it is they actually want around memorial. And then actually, talk about the feasibility of achieving it in a satisfactory manner in as timely a way as possible.
Thanks, Fiona. And I suppose I would concur with everything that you're saying there. And that's been the consistent feedback that we have been getting. And I suppose in terms of all of the inquiries into the different institutional abuse across the island, we can see overwhelmingly the slow response or the slow action from the state and the institutions compounds hurt and belittles victims and survivors, and is just a further insult upon injury. And we can even see that in the 26 counties in the past couple of weeks around the redress scheme for the mother and baby homes, and how offensive that was. And following Christopher's point earlier around the institutions and the fact that we're talking about organisations that sit on massive wealth and have an obligation there and often aren't very forthcoming with it. So perhaps as a committee we can write again to the First and Deputy First Minister and ask for a commitment to this apology as soon as possible, and for proper resourcing for the officials that are working on this. So thank you again for your presentation and for your answers. And I suppose from my part, if there's anything that we can do, I'm committed to do that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Emma. And can I bring Diane Dawes into the spotlight, please? Thank you.
I suppose it's good afternoon now, Fiona. And first of all, I do also want to associate myself with the apology from the chair. I think it is very important that people understand that, one, it's not a normal occurrence, but two, it is unfortunate and regrettable that it happened. Couple of things that I'm interested in relation to your figures that you gave at the start. You said that there'd been 2,199 applications to the board, 1,663, I think, considered. How many have had outcomes?
My understanding is that the 1663 relates to having gone in front of a panel, and so they're the ones that would have gone to determination. And
they've had the determination. Sorry, it's not that they've gone in front of a panel and they're sitting there. They've had the determination.
That's my understanding, yes. And that obviously this is for the redress board to answer more appropriately. But yes, that they have gone in front of, or to be considered by a panel. And just so we're very clear here, we're talking about applications from survivors via solicitors, which go through a portal into the redress board, which go through a verification process, which is then put subsequent to a number of stages then in front of a panel to be considered.
Right. And we're pretty clear that those also have had an outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of those included in the 1663 would have, say, will go on to potential appeal. There may be initial payments, but they have had an outcome, if that makes sense.
And the other issue that wasn't clear to me, in terms of services for victims of abuse, where do you see the need remaining? Because this is very specific need, because it's historical, and it could be even, I'm presuming by now, intergenerational and so on. Where do you see the gaps in the need?
I think that's a great observation. I'm very conscious that when I appeared before the committee on Wednesday, it was preceded by a presentation regarding transgenerational impact from trauma.
Yes.
I think what would be useful for us to understand is that, when we're talking about historical institutional childhood abuse, that we are talking about childhood abuse, and that this happened, while it did happen historically, the reality is that most child abuse is reported historically, even that which didn't happen in institutions. So when you're looking at services, and I suppose this is me bringing my previous background here as well, when we're looking at services, we're looking at providing a spectrum of services. I think the important thing, again, is always to start with survivors. What do we know survivors need at different times? Now, obviously, the Victim and Survivor Service, VSS, have undertaken considerable work in this area, and with their community partners, WAVE, are seeking to address the needs of victims of historical institutional childhood abuse. So far, like I said, they've engaged with, and I reached out to ask them, 439 survivors have engaged in access support. And it's they could be accessing more than one intervention at a time. So that's important in and of itself. But I think it's really important to get across to this committee that we know, for example, that, even if you take, say, the redress applications, 2,000, and you look at the numbers accessing services and accepting that for some people, they don't want services and they don't need services, but even allowing for that there's probably a significant number of survivors who may be going through generic or general health services. I think that creates an imperative on all of us then, particularly service providers, to be trauma informed in terms of our approach. And one of the things that we had been doing in the start of the year and throughout the year is in preparation, for example, for an apology happening, was that we had been reaching out to service providers who weren't specifically designated, shall we say, to engage with survivors of historical institutional childhood abuse. So it could have been the Victim Service or Nexus or other services to say, look, the reality is that while someone may not disclose of their experiences, you could be engaging with someone who's gone through an institution and who is a victim of historic institutional childhood abuse. And that it's important to keep that in mind through being trauma informed, through being victim centered, in your practice. And of course, those services are already doing that, but it was up to, I suppose, myself as a commissioner to kind of reinforce that message. What we would like to do in the new year, and I was actually talking briefly to Sinead about this before we came on the call, and talking to the Victim and Survivor Service, is to look at the survivor journey through all the services that are ostensibly available to victims of historic institutional childhood abuse, and also when they engage with ourselves, because while we're not, as a Commissioner's Office, not a service provider, we are engaging in signposting and making people information available to survivors. But also to look at that journey through the other services as well. So if you imagine putting survivors at the centre, the next circle out would be those agencies dealing or engaging directly with survivors. And then the next service out from, or circle out from that, will be those services that are used by survivors but may not be the specialist or specific services for them. I don't know if that answers or goes to answering your question.
No, well, it does in a sense, and you talk about services. I think there's also a gap in terms of policy, in that we need to look and focus some of our policy through the lens of survivors of abuse, survivors of terrorist violence. And I don't think that we actually see policy. We see it in very defined ways, and we don't see the round of it. And I intend to have a conversation with Jane Brady, the new head of the Civil Service, who I think is open to new ideas, because I do think that sometimes we need to see not just the services but the policy in a wider context, and we have ways of doing that. And we have Section 75 groups in Northern Ireland, but I do think that we need to look at how we're making policy and how that policy relates to the wider community, including people who have suffered institutional abuse. You focus very much on the 20th of January as a specific date. Is there time to get an apology that is, I don't know how to phrase it, but is there time to get an apology that is comprehensive enough, that is, I think apologies need to be from the heart, they need to be meant. Is there time to do that in consultation with victims groups? And really the same question around the memorial. My greatest take from today is your sheer and utter frustration that you convey because of the length of time things have taken, and I think you eloquently advocate for victims on that particular point. And I think if the committee takes nothing away from today, it is about to induce a greater sense of urgency into what has to be done. But I think apology, anybody can apologise, but we need to apologise and mean it. And again, I just throw in as well, I hope is the lack of contribution from the organisations involved in this, does that indicate a lack of willingness to take accountability? So, sorry, that's a lot of questions in one. My apologies.
It is a lot of questions in one, and you've made some great observations. I suppose just taking it from the top, I come from the third sector and the private sector, so I have a horror of silos, and I have a horror of assembly line, for want of a better term, so assembly line thinking in terms of complex social issues. And I think that's why I outlined for you, and I think you very much picked up on that. The reality is that there are specialist services there for victims and survivors of historic institutional childhood abuse, and they need to be there. And then there are also specialist services for victims and survivors of child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse, and they need to be there. Of course, there will be a crossover, and we need to understand. And I think by one of the things that we've been talking about doing with the victims and survivor service is mapping the survivor journey, and to make it survivor focused, so that you're not trying to view this through the lens of agencies, but our policymakers. You're looking at where are survivors, what do they need, and then working out from survivors, so that your service response and your policy response starts with them and is driven by them in terms of their needs, rather than trying to impose a solution on them. And I think you see that reflected in co-design, but also I think even in my own office, I very much try to get across the idea that we're working on a project basis, on a program basis, that we work cross-functionally, and agilely, and all the words that sound like buzzwords, but actually what they mean is you're working responsively and flexibly to identified emerging need that's based on evidence. And again, I highlighted with this committee what I perceive as a lack of genuine research to inform, the whole research-informed evidence-based policy making. It sounds, again, trite to say it, but it's important that we remember it. If I am sounding frustrated, it's probably because I am a little. And, well, actually, I probably am a lot. And yet I don't think I probably have the right to be frustrated because I'm only working in this role a year. I can't imagine what it's like for survivor representatives.
Yes.
And that's why I thanked them for their expertise and their patience, because the patience that survivors have been asked to demonstrate, frankly, leaves me speechless. They have been asked literally, in some cases, their whole lives to wait, and then, as I said, and I think it's really important to get this across, their experiences were frequently denied, minimized, rejected, and we need to remember that. And so, it really, really concentrated my mind to think that it has been 9 years in January since this inquiry started, 5 years since the report was published. Sir Anthony Hart said 6 months after that, there needs to be urgency in implementation of these recommendations. And yet we're still asking survivors to wait. And at the same time, and I do appreciate the point that you're trying to make, the balance, we want to get it right. We need to get it right. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that I had said back in the earlier part of this year that there were issues with the redress process and that I was merely reflecting what I had been told by individual survivors and survivor representatives. And I said this in the earlier part of the year. And now here we are in December and we're having a conversation going about timing and feasibility, which is important to have. But, you look back and you go, well, were there opportunities there that we could have moved this forward in a more timely manner? And I think there probably were.
Fiona, thank you so much. I do think that you very eloquently convey the frustrations, the annoyance of victims around the issue of time. And I suppose to the chair, if there are things that we can do to make sure that that timescale pressure that we can keep on to make sure that that timescale is lessened, I think that in and of itself would be a good outcome. Thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our members who have been asking questions, but great thanks to you yourself, Commissioner, for your time today and giving it so freely, and for the evidence that you have given to the committee. You've been very thorough, you've been very honest, you've been direct and succinct, and you have very adequately and advocated on behalf of the victims. We heard the victims speaking through you today, and that's you doing your job and doing it well when that happens. I can sense the urgency, and I think all of the members really, have reflected that urgency and that frustration of the lack of delivery, or even the lack of actually stating a date and time that delivery will take place in all of this. So obviously the review process has started, and that's very, very welcome, but we need it done, and we need it done quickly, and we need the outcomes. But the apology must move forward with a sense of urgency as well, and hopefully work on the memorial is happening as we speak. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank any visitor or any of the victims and survivors out there that are watching the proceedings of the committee. I want to give them our full support going forward, and we will do everything that we can to ensure that the Executive Office acts with urgency. And I want to wish you and your family and all the families listening in today a very happy and peaceful and joyful Christmas, and hopefully a successful outcome for all of our victims in the early part of the new year. The committee will now reflect on your evidence and will make our recommendations to the Executive Office. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, everyone, thank you very, very much for that. I suppose now just actions as a result of what we've heard. Hello?
Anytime, as soon as possible.
Sorry, Diane, your mic is on, your speaker's on. So there's a couple of things in there, and I don't know, I'm sure you probably all heard them as well as I, but I think that the committee needs to acknowledge the significance of the 20th of January date and the 5th anniversary date of the HART recommendations. Would the committee be happy for us to write to the Executive Office and ask them to give a due consideration of marking this milestone with a full and wide-reaching apology, or a timeline for that apology? Would that be a recommendation coming from the committee?
Agreed.
Yeah?
Agreed. I'd be happy for, yes, definitely.
In relation, I think another important point to make to the Executive Office is that we ask them to speed up the work with the review process, and just indicate that, you know, it needs to proceed urgently and simultaneously, obviously, with the apology. But also, I would like to actually find out more information about the memorial process as well. You know, is that been processed as we speak, that we just don't have a real good understanding of it, and I think we need to know more about that. So are members happy that we get some more clarification in and around the memorial?
Yeah.
Okay, and then the other, just reflecting on what Christopher had talked about as well, can we ask the Executive Office to give us an update on what work that they have done with institutions and advise on what level of cooperation that they've had, and name any institutions perhaps that are not engaging fully or cooperating with the contributions to the victims.
Chair, yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I think in our letter to the Executive Office we should ask or encourage that the team within the civil service that are working on this are resourced properly so that it can be completed with the urgency it deserves.
Well, Emma, that was the next thing I was going to ask about, because I think you made that point, that there has to be adequate resourcing around this. One of the areas that I felt came out very, very strongly as well, again, back to the communication piece and the engagement piece. And it's, you know, communication and engagement, they fall down basically because inadequate resources in and around the teams that are working on this. So it's really important that they have the resources that they require in order to deliver these outcomes and to deliver them as soon as possible. Look, folks, this is...
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just on the question of the contributions, I don't know what discussion's going on there with the institutions, but I can't help thinking, I always go back to the insurance question. Is there a reluctance on the institutions to engage in terms of contributions because it's effectively an admission of liability? They may be under instructions from their insurers not to say that, you know.
And I think that that's what we need to learn. The committee needs to have that feedback. So we have to understand where those discussions are at the moment, and is anything holding them up, or are there any blockages or barriers? We as a committee need to know that as well. But we would urge the Executive Office to communicate just the level of engagement that is going on at the moment. Or do members have any other areas that they wish us to take forward as a result of this at the moment? No. Are you speaking?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I think that covers it, Chair. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, and I think just in our communications, Michael, we have to make a robust representation to the Executive Office and express our sense of frustration as a committee that this process is experiencing delay after delay after delay, and the review that is currently taking place, it must proceed with pace. There can be no dillying and dallying in relation to this. They've set out very clearly what the terms of reference are. There are a number of areas that they have to cover, but they can do it very quickly within the time frame that they had expressed at the very beginning, and we can't see any further delay. Victims deserve their dignity and they deserve an apology. So are we happy to move on? I have just a couple of things that I would like the members to bear with me for a few minutes more, because we didn't have a quorum. There was a couple of areas, actions that we wanted to take forward on Wednesday's meeting. So I'm just going to outline some of the actions, and if members are happy enough, then we can close off on Wednesday's meeting. A number of actions were raised by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in relation to Article 2 of the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. Can I seek members' agreement to approve the following actions? To write to the Secretary of State in relation to the UK Government's Nationality and Borders Bill and the potential impact this will have on people's rights significantly in the border areas. Secondly, to write to the Secretary of State and the Irish Government in relation to consider legislating for the protection of rights concerning the common travel area and the free movement of people. And thirdly, to write to the Secretary of State regarding the accreditation status of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and the possibility of further funding of their work in relation to the dedicated mechanism and Article 2 of the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. Are members happy to proceed with those actions?
Great.
Okay. There's also actions following oral evidence session with the Centre of Children's Rights at Queen's University Belfast. I'm going to put my teeth in now. Sorry, can I ask members to agreement for that we forward their report titled "It Didn't End in 1998," which examines the impact of conflict legacy across generations to the junior ministers due to the areas of overlap within the FIC report. And secondly, to have conflict legacy issues in the committee legacy report as a point of interest for the new committee to take forward in the next mandate. Are members happy enough for us to proceed with that? Okay. Forward Work Programme, pages 41 to 48 of the meeting pack of the Forward Work Programme. Members, the first meeting after Christmas recess will be on the 12th of January and will be an oral evidence with junior ministers in relation to the EU matters and a briefing from departmental officials on January monitoring. If they're content to note the remainder of the Forward Work Programme. Okay, and members, just correspondence, item number 4 of the previous agenda. There was 12 items of correspondence at pages 49 to 703 in the meeting pack. If members are agreed to note, I will leave it at that.
Great.
Okay, so any other business from any of the members? If you are all happy, I brought up earlier about setting up a WhatsApp group just so that we have another line of communication if everything else fails to be the committee. If members are agreed, we'll get that set up. Okay, and item number 6 is date and time and place of next meeting. Members, the next meeting will take place on Wednesday, the 12th of January at 2 p.m. in room 30. And I wish you all a very Merry Christmas.
Merry
Christmas, everyone.
Happy Christmas, everybody.
Yeah,
you too. And thank you to the clerk and the teams for everything today. It was great just to get it reconvened quickly and to deal with the work in a dignified manner. And I hope that we've regained the trust of the victims and survivors out there, because they deserve our support. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
No,